Miliochuke, ha habi Nicolás Juárez. Hello, my name is Nicolás Juárez. I'm a graduate student of social work and Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. My family comes from Huixla, Chiapas, Mexico, and we descend from the Tzotzil people there. Residing in Austin, Texas, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the genocide and violent dispossession of the Alabama Pucushada, Caddo, Corizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Ipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Ysleta del Sur Pueblo peoples, as well as the violent legacy of black chattel slavery that made and makes possible the city of Austin and its institutions. With the utmost humility, I offer my words here in service of their memory, hoping that it might be possible to find ways of being for and with each other that are no longer dependent on mass death as the condition of possibility. This mass death brings me to the topic of the paper I want to present today, leaving the world. In several indigenous creation stories from various peoples grouped under the label Aztec or Maya in Latin America to the Hopi or Dene in the United States, there is a thematic of leaving previous worlds. Sometimes people leave worlds because they are being destroyed. Sometimes they are asked to leave. And sometimes they leave because living in that world would be unbearable due to its uninhabitable or inhospitable nature. This paper seeks to explore the nature of indigenous worlding and politics by examining how indigenous creation stories serve as indigenous philosophy and how such a philosophy can guide indigenous organizing and action. Through this, it goes further to ask how it might be possible to reconceptualize indigenous worlding or relationality through the thematics of leaving and finding worlds, and what it might mean to leave this world, since we are not only facing gratuitous and perverse violence daily, but also confronting the existential threats of ecological devastation and nuclear warfare. Beginning with creation stories, it's necessary to foreground their utmost importance to indigenous people and our ways of living. As Laguna Pueblo author Leslie Mormon Silko writes in Ceremony, quote, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death." End quote. Such a sentiment is echoed throughout indigenous literature, philosophy, and critical theory. Stories, of course, exceed the purely literary form. Indigenous stories range from the classically indigenous oral tradition to novels and short stories, to poems, jokes, or even visual media. Not only this, but indigenous stories need not be, nor are, ancient relics, but can be anything from pre-colonization to the stories we create and tell amongst each other today. In fact, we might say that indigenous stories express an indigenous worldview in both its specific localities, as well as what Kimberly G. Weiser has called its intertribalisms. If, as Yacarilla Apache philosopher V.F. Cordova has argued, that the purpose of the philosopher is to give expression to the unique worldview of a people, then an examination of indigenous stories can provide us with the opportunity to more deeply explore what a Native American philosophy might be. Following that, I want to look at one of the creation stories in the Codex Chilmapopoca, an Aztec codex that contains the particular story I'd like to look at, the Legend of the Suns. I've chosen this codex and this story for two reasons. First, the codex makes several references to biblical stories and contains Spanish words throughout. As such, I think it makes no claim to purity in story, but instead is an example of how indigenous stories are living stories, stories which reflect the needs of the people telling them, and that change and adapt as those peoples gain new information, have new experiences, and speak new languages. In an attempt to refuse purity or the discourse of authenticity, I believe this story shows us how, as indigenous peoples, we are not in search of a transcendental truth that spans the whole of time and space, but of a truth that is more spatially located, as Oglala Lakota philosopher Vine Deloria Jr. might suggest. Second, the story details a creation story that also describes multiple worlds before the current world we live in. As such, it might offer us the possibility of exploring how creation stories can provide us with the philosophy and tactics of leaving worlds and surviving them. The tale itself follows the story of 5 suns, or eras, in which humanity is made, remade, or transmuted. As such, it can provide a potential way to think about leaving the world, or serve as a basis for praxis that takes a hostile approach to the world we currently live in. This version of the story, recorded in the Codex, comes from a translation by John Bierhorst, who was the first to translate the complete text of the legend of the 5 of the Suns in English. Sidestepping due to the scope, the issue of translation, I'd like to provide a brief summary of the tale. However, you'll have to bear with me, as my Nahuatl is not always the best in pronunciation. The story goes as follows. In the beginning, the first deity, Omoteotl, creates the deity Tezcatlipoca, who is 4 separate aspects, but also unified. Each of the aspects have a separate name: Quetzalcoatl, Huitzilopochtli, Chipetotec, and Tezcatlipoca. Tezcatlipoca is a deity of night and sorcery and is the first sun. The Tezcatlipocas as a group create the first people, who are giants. However, Quetzalcoatl, fueled by sibling rivalry, knocks Tezcatlipoca out of the sky, and he ceases to be the sun. Tezcatlipoca, in his rage, sends his Jaguars to eat all of the people of the earth. And that is the end of the first sun. After knocking Tezcatlipoca from the sky, Quetzalcoatl becomes the second sun. Again, the Tezcatlipocas as a group create a new race of normal-sized people. But these people eventually stop honoring the Tezcatlipocas, and so Tezcatlipoca turns them all into monkeys, displaying his might as the deity of sorcery. Quetzalcoatl, however, loved the people, even in their flaws, and in anger summoned a great wind that blew them all away off the face of the earth and ceased to be the sun, so that he could go about the job of creating a new people. And that is the end of the second sun, or era. Tlaloc, a deity of rain and fertility, becomes the third sun. However, Tezcatlipoca steals his wife, and Tlaloc, in his grief, refuses to move in the sky, with the sun bearing down at all times, creating a great drought. However, this causes the peoples of Earth to wail and complain. But in his grief, annoyed by the complaints of the people living in the drought, Tlaloc rains down massive fires and burns everything in one day, such that the entire earth is burned to ash. From here, the Tezcatlipocas must create a new earth and new peoples. And finally, there is the fourth son, Hulischalchiuhtlicue, who would also be Tlaloc's new wife. She is very kind, but Tezcatlipoca was cruel, and he said that she was only kind to the people because she wanted to be praised. Heartbroken by Tezcatlipoca's cruelty, she began to sob and flooded the world for 52 years, drowning everyone, with the peoples living on Earth becoming fish to survive. This brings us to our current times, which begins when Quetzalcoatl, unwilling to accept the death of his people, ventures into the underworld to take their bones back from Mictlantecuhtli, the deity of the dead. He then bleeds upon the bones to bring humanity back to life. However, there is still a need for a sun, so the various deities convene around a giant sacrificial fire, from which a new sun will rise, but only Nahuatl is willing to sacrifice himself to become the sun. And this new sun, the sun of movement, is our current sun and is the world we currently live in. To unpack this story in full and discuss its many variants, as well as the multiple sources that inform this particular reading, would exceed the time we have. However, here, I want to focus on how the story enables us to think of politics of leaving the world and the ending of worlds. Following Paul Kockelman's reading of this particular tale, and Deloria's more general claim, I recognize that the metaphysics and grammars of settler colonialism are too thoroughly pervasive to entertain any attempt at an authentic reading. However, as Chippewa philosopher Gerald Visner takes up the trickster, I am equally interested in a trickster reading practice that might eschew authenticity in favor of a communal and inventive reading. That is to say, I am less interested in attempting to find some true communal reading in the graveyard of Native history, in favor of asking what this story can do for us, Indigenous peoples, in the present, and how it can give us a practice for finding a way out of the world. To begin in broad metaphysical strokes, I want to propose that this story illustrates, along with several other various creation stories, that Indigenous worlding is, in fact, not performed by Indigenous peoples. It might more properly be said that Indigenous peoples find ourselves in worlds pre-made or made by something more than human agency. To put it another way, Indigenous worlds reject a humanist Promethean metaphysics, which assumes that human beings carry within themselves the capacity to create worlds. Instead, humans are, at best, participatory actors in the ongoing process of the cosmos, and, at worst, are simply at the mercy of powers far greater than us. Put differently, I would argue that an Indigenous metaphysics might recognize the impossibility of Indigenous worlding in favor of the finding of worlds. In an Indigenous cosmos, worlds are blooming in all direction, but in order to find them, much less survive, there is a necessity to act properly and to pay attention. As a metaphysical principle, this suggests that an Indigenous practice would aim not to transform or control the world proper, but would rather align itself with the processes of the earth itself, where we might understand the earth as a properly philosophical concept that names the ground, which contains all virtualities, and from which our actual worlds spring forth. As such, Indigenous practice would involve a kind of eco-aesthetics, wherein new worlds are constantly cultivated, and people are free to move to and from when worlds become inhospitable. To be clear, this is not a refiguration of noble savage iconography that assumes Indians are biologically close to nature, but instead suggests that the onto-epistemologies of Indigenous stories suggest to us that in becoming the vehicles of the will of the earth, we might provide a partial answer to the foremost question in Native American philosophy: what road should humans walk? To not walk this path, as the legend of the sun shows us, invites only suffering. The second peoples refuse the order set forth by the Tezcatlipocas, and find themselves blown away by a great wind. When the third people complain to the sky, they find themselves burnt to ash. Of all the people to survive in any form, it is only the fourth people who themselves become fish. Perhaps this suggests a reinvention of the terms of survival. What would it mean to suggest a survival that does not attempt to carry with us a human body? As Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro writes, quote, "What we are calling body, then, is not the specific physiology or characteristic anatomy of something, but an ensemble of ways or modes of being that constitutes a habitus, ethos, or ethogram. Lying between the formal subjectivity of souls and the substantial materiality of organisms is a middle axial plane, that is the body qua bundle of affects and capacities." End quote. Even the people we are today comes from the bones of a previous people and the blood of Quetzalcoatl. We are and never have been who we used to be. The kind of Indigenous eco-aesthetics proposed above might then involve the cultivation of new existential territories, scaled from our individual bodies to the planet itself. If this is the broadest philosophical strokes, what does it mean to translate this into practice? First, let us turn this approach towards a critique of conquest in the Western Hemisphere. Such an approach would render conquest an impossibility in both practice and metaphysics. Settlers shifted entire biomes into each other, carelessly and with haste, disrupting ecological systems that had been tended to and negotiated with since time immemorial. This is not to mention the endless campaigns of violence that settlers initiated. Their genocidal impetus wrecked the essential roles native peoples played in their ecosystems, and destroyed the uniqueness of indigenous communities qua ecosystems themselves. This is not to mention the full impossibility of slavery. Plantation ecologies are settler ecologies. They're ecologies which cleared land, imported foreign fauna and flora, and made captivity a constitutive condition of black life. In contrast to this, the earth cultivates peoples who are adapted to the places they are in and travel through, who possess intimate knowledge of the animal, plant, spirit, mineral, meteorological, and divine kin in those areas, and who expressed and lived in their own unique worlds. European ontologies and metaphysics, in contrast, elevate the human to a quasi-divine position, and as such disregard place and the earth qua process. In doing so, they have, in a mere 5 centuries, effectively pushed our species to the brink of extinction, issued in regimes of terror that are disproportionately handed out to those deemed non-human, and have initiated a way of life so alienating and horrendous that many of us cannot even conceive of a life absent the torturous mundanity of the workplace or the devastating loneliness and hollowness of the caricatures of community remaining. Such a condition is so pervasive that we would name moments of joy between black or native peoples as revolutionary, when in truth, we know they are not challenges to power, as much as they are ways we will persist until revolution can come. Critique alone, of course, is not sufficient. What can this alternative indigenous metaphysics instruct us on what to do? Let me be clear, it does not formulate a properly political praxis. It does not suggest that so-and-so government must exist, nor does it formulate a set of ethical principles that must be abided by. Instead, it directs our attention to a proliferation of techniques, what might be called an indigenous eco-technics, that embody the will of the earth qua the endless production, proliferation, and expansion of indigenous existential territories. Let me articulate a few. When indigenous peoples block, sabotage, and disrupt pipelines, this is an indigenous eco-technics because it challenges the logics of empire and industrialism, which seek absolute capital production from the earth. When black peoples riot and burn down the institutions which maintain captivity as a principle of black existence, this is an indigenous eco-technics because slavery by nature restricts the free movement of living beings across the earth as they grow, expand, and become different and more. When foreign migrants learn the intimacies of the desert they cross, searching for new homelands outside the necropolitical zones demarcated by colonialism, this is an indigenous eco-technics because it forms an erotics between flesh and desert that serve as an embodied refusal of colonial borders. All of these are indigenous eco-technics because they are a set of techniques that derive from the conditions in a place a people find themselves in, and they express the will of the earth to proliferate worlds. I will admit that I am unsure of an exact conclusion. What I will say is that in reading indigenous stories, I find myself figuring out new ways to act, new ways to fuck shit up, and new ways to create new ways of being for and with others. Following Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, I am trying to find an elsewhere and elsewhen, where my life is guided by the expression of love, where I myself am freed from the way power constitutes me in service of its aims at times, where I have time to walk out across the new earth and tend to corn in the same way my ancestors did. As such, every day I am cultivating myself as a vehicle for the will of the earth. I invite you to do the same, and I hope to see you in the world after this one. Koloval.